Welcome back, Honors. All right, so you guys absolutely crushed ancient Egypt, right? And now I need y'all to go ahead and buckle up because yes, this is a little bit longer of a flip, and is it gonna be okay? Yes, Mr. Terry, it's gonna be fine because we gotta kind of get used to this block schedule and we gotta keep making sure we're moving, right? Expect your first test to be either the end of next week or the very beginning of the following one, right? But it is coming up soon because we're actually about a little past the halfway marker of this entire unit, right? Of course, being on the ancient civilizations. And your study guide is posted and it is available. Other really important thing to remember about the study guides, though, is that they are subject to change, right? So they can kind of change a little bit over time. I don't make new ones every single year, but sometimes I'll add a little bit of something or I'll take something away. So just make sure you're kind of staying prevalent on that. And if you can't find an answer to something, be like, hey, Mr. Terry, number 5, couldn't find that anywhere, and I'll either give you the answer in class, or I'll find it in your notes, or I'll just tell you to cross it out and just kind of ignore it, all right? But anyway, let's go ahead and get into the fact that now Egypt has fallen, and in the next class, you're taking your first content quiz, right? You're taking your first quiz, your multiple choice quiz. It's going to be 20 questions on Mesopotamia and Egypt, 10 for each, right? So big things to understand, though, is now Mesopotamia has kind of fallen off. And Egypt has kind of fallen off, right? And so now we're seeing these tiny little fledgling kingdoms kind of pop up, and then they're going to start kind of exacting their own influence around the Mediterranean, right? So big things that we left off on was kind of the fall of the Egyptians, right? We saw the fall of 2 particularly large, great powers, right? We saw the Mesopotamians kind of lose a lot of their influence following the Neo-Babylonian era, and then we also saw the Egyptians kind of fall off as well towards the end of their New Kingdom period. Then they entered the Third Intermediate period, and following the push out of the Hittites, they actually entered this period called the Late Period, which is kind of them just scrambling around to get back to square before they get invaded by the Greeks, right? So the big thing about it is, after they finally push out the Hittites, the Egyptians kind of don't have a law system anymore. The concept of Mot has been completely thrown out the window. They don't have the wealth that they had in the New Kingdom period. Their centralized government is beginning to collapse. And after all of these invasions, Egypt was left pretty poor and kind of powerless, right? So they weren't necessarily this big, large, terrifyingly intense kingdom that they were at one point, right? And that's really important to understand, is that these big empires like the Babylonians and the Akkadians and several others are just kind of falling off the map a little bit, right? So with that, though, they're also going to start seeing a lot of new settlers come in, right? So the Nile River Valley is going to start being settled by the Kushite Nubians, right, who are going to create themselves as the Kushite Nubians. But originally they're the Kushites and then the Nubians. Libyans or native Libyans are going to start coming in as well and starting to settle this fertile Nile River Valley due to the fact that the Nile actually had, remember, how hard was it to plant something if you were an Egyptian? Not hard at all. You just shoved a seed in the dirt, according to Herodotus, the Greek historian, and it would grow, right? They planted everything along the banks of the Nile River, and it was such an effective system that they based their entire calendar off of it, right? So Egypt was able to bring a lot of these individuals in and assimilate these people into their society briefly, but eventually the 3 settling communities are going to start adopting small Egyptian traits, and cultural diffusion is going to start blowing up. But Egypt was never quite able to get back to the power that it once was, right? So the big thing is, though, you're going to start seeing small, little tiny guys pop up. And a big, important, very super important one is the Phoenicians, right? The Phoenicians. The Phoenicians, a society of traders, right? So the big thing about it is this cultural group known as the Phoenicians actually existed or started in what is modern-day Lebanon, right? So modern-day Lebanon, right above where Israel is, right? They are considered this society of sailors, right? So they never really had massive settlements, right? They never really had huge city-states, or they didn't have a big empire. They had trading cities all over the Mediterranean that they would sail from place to place on, trading goods from other kingdoms, right? While Egypt was strong and also while it was weak, they would go trade there. When the early Greeks, the little tiny Minoans, are starting their entire endeavor forward, they are like, okay, let's show up, right? And then they would show up and they would trade with them, right? And so these guys literally, just in all capital letters next to the rise of Phoenicians, you should be like, cultural diffusion out the yin-yang, right? It's just they're growing and they're spreading all these traits, and it's a super interesting premise because the fact that they never never actually had a specific settlement, and since they were on the water constantly, they were never actually enslaved by any of the big empires like the Babylonians or the Egyptians or the Hittites or the Akkadians or the Babylonians, or like some of the other ones that were actually super prevalent, right? Or the Persians, right? They were never actually settled or enslaved by these people. And a lot of that had to do with their master shipbuilding techniques, right? They actually were the very first people in all of Western society to create these giant vessels that could easily cross the Mediterranean and actually move around. Now, an interesting premise, though, they weren't the most effective ships on the planet, and they sometimes required slave labor to row them if the wind wasn't in their favor, right? So the Phoenicians actually were the first Westerners to develop square-sailed vessels, which becomes a very Western trait, right? You can actually tell the difference between a Western vessel and an Eastern vessel during their ancient time periods because the square-shaped ships are usually Western and the triangular-shaped ships are usually Eastern. You have those of like the ancient Chinese, the ancient Japanese, the ancient Arabic, right? So the big thing about the square-sailed ships is, yes, they were powerful and could move pretty quickly, but the triangular-sailed ships could sail into the wind if necessary, right? And so eventually the triangular sails are going to become dominant, and they're going to become the necessary thing that Westerners later on in like 1400s Europe need so they can actually go from Spain to the Americas. Hey, Columbus. All right, now anyway, but continuing forward. So the Phoenicians, literally, look at them. They had trade routes everywhere, and they had settlements here. They had another settlement here. They had a settlement here, which does eventually become majorly large. One important thing you need to know about the Phoenicians is they did start some of these city-states that would eventually grow into become their own states, right? And the big one actually right here, they were known as the Carthaginians, or Carthage, right? So some of y'all who have Latin right now, you've probably heard of Carthage before because the Romans and them had this huge set of wars, and it was not very nice nor fun. So anyway, but the Phoenicians did set up some small city-states and trade depots that they would use to just kind of bop all around the like Mediterranean. And of course, right here is really important because those are our first Westerners ever, right? Those are our first extreme Westerners, the Minoans, who are actually going to settle up on Crete, right? Now, why are the Phoenicians called the Phoenicians exactly? Well, the word Phoenician, much like Mesopotamia, is actually a word of Greek origin, right? Our first Westerners. The first true Western civilization in only Western form are the Greeks, right? So we have adopted a lot of words from the Greek language in the ancient Greeks and how they referred to these different people, right? So the Mesopotamians, of course, that means the land between two rivers in Greek. Phoenician in Greek actually means purple people, all right? So the people who are not, and it's not like Phoenicians showed up wearing nothing but Sperry's because they were on boats all the time and they were purple. It's not how it works. But it's mainly because the Phoenicians were the only people in the Mediterranean that had access to this blue or purple cloth, right? So they had the ability to take a very specific material and grind it up and create a blue and purple dye, right? So some historians have argued it might be a chemical known as alum, A-L-U-M, that is actually derived from mines and underground. Some other historians have argued it might be some snail shells that actually might be near Lebanon that could be ground up and dyed purple as well. So, but it's like they're the only ones that had access to it. And this purple cloth happened to be very expensive because they were the only ones that had access to it. So the only people who could afford it to wear it were royals and nobility. So eventually purple from the Phoenicians would become the color of nobility and wealth, right? So anyway, but the Greeks were one of their very first and most popular customers, right? Because they were actually growing and they were on the rise. But they traded with everybody. They traded with the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Hittites, and they brought the best skills from all these different places all over the world, right? Bronze metallurgy traveled the Mediterranean because of the Phoenicians. Later, iron metallurgy is going to travel the Mediterranean, a lot of it because of the Phoenicians. Also because the Hittites took over a lot of stuff, and they were the ones that actually knew how to use it. So, like, the big thing about it, though, the Phoenicians are going to create is something you're using right now. The Phoenicians created the very, very first phonetic alphabet, right? So you have to understand the progression of language. When we talked about the progression of language going into cuneiform, you have pictograms, ideograms, phonetics, right? So pictograms, also known as logograms, are these things where like these, like these like images represent entire concepts, right? Like you have like a money symbol, right? That's a logogram because it represents money, the concept of money. Well, that's an ideogram, actually. Sorry about that. Pictogram could be like, for example, like ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, right? So that where a picture represents an entire word. Then you have these other things known as ideograms, and you also have a contingent of that called syllabries, right? So, but ideograms are things that represent entire ideas, right? Now, phonetics, on the other hand, is what the Phoenicians are going to invent, and it's a genius idea. It actually, a lot of it comes out of their society. They had to trade with so many people that they took some of the original cuneiform language bases, noticing using their ideas of Aleph, and because Aleph is the word that the Mesopotamians used for ox, and it's why the very, very first A itself is actually going to look kind of like an ox with horns, right? Like a cow with horns, as you can see right here. And so they're going to take it, and they're going to create a letter that is symbolized in a sound, like Aleph, Ah, right? And they're going to use that. Beth, which would then later be actually used as well. This one of my favorites, is Heh, and not Heh, that's actually the later on origin of F. It's this one, Heth. Heth in the Mesopotamian language meant fence, right? So actually the the Phoenicians took that symbol and they were like Heth, fence, Heth, and they actually created a phonetic alphabet. And a phonetic alphabet is an alphabet completely based off sound, right? It's when you have an A sounds like ah, and a B sounds like buh, and a C sounds like k, and then they would actually combine their letters together to create a more fluid language and informational sending system, right? This way they could keep track of their trade products, keep track of the people they interacted with, and they could actually keep track of all the goods they needed to move, right? And so after trading with so many people, the Phoenicians created this alphabet based off sound, and it spread immediately to the Greeks and the Romans, right? And actually you can see it because this is the Greek and Roman alphabet, right? Because you have alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, eta, theta, iota, kappa, lambda, mu, nu, xi, right? So, and then it eventually keeps going as it goes on to omega, and so it goes omicron, rho, sigma, tau, Omicron, rho, sigma, tau, epsilon, phi, chi, psi, zeta, omega, right? So that right there, as you can tell, though, is a little bit of an extension. So something you need to understand is that the Phoenician alphabet was the first phonetic one. It was all based in sound. But the Phoenician alphabet, I think, was only 22 letters, and it had no vowels, right? It was all consonants. The Greeks are going to take that concept, and they're going to start adding vowel sounds to it, which is really, really important. So anyway, that is huge, okay? So the Phoenicians are this society of traders, these purple people that kind of spread their phonetic alphabet and idea and the basis of our language. Phoenicians are responsible for creating a system that you're using to write down all this information right now. That's wild, right? Then you're going to see the growth of another group of people, right? The growth of our Old Testament writers themselves, right? The growth of the people that came from the Exodus, the growth of the people that used the Passover story, right? Sorry about that. I was just looking for another one. The growth of the people known as the children of Israel, the people that are the basis that created the Old Testament, that is the basis of the modern Christian Bible, right? And that is the children of Israel, right? So the Hittites, right, in their growth are eventually going to kind of fall due to some weak leaders, right? Egypt is kind of going down, and this is going to give way to a ton of these small states being established, right? South of Phoenicia was a group of people known as the Hebrews, right? And the Hebrews are going to rise up, and they're going to start creating their very own cultural system, right? Give me 1 second. So now, sorry about that. I had to go ahead and get this entire presentation up and all this other stuff. But the big thing that you know about the Hebrews all connects back to the faith that they created, right? The faith of Judaism. So Jews, Jewish, a.k.a. the Hebrews, right? One and the same society, okay? Now, the big wave, the shock wave that they send throughout the ancient world has to do with their monotheistic religious structure, right? The monotheistic structure that actually is the basis of course, like Christianity and its growth as well. Of course, as we know, one of the most famous Jewish people of all time being Christ himself, right? Which is a super amazing story. One of my favorite stories from the Bible to this day is still the story of him going into the temple and flipping the tables of the traders, right? And actually being a part of like the entire Jewish community before he actually was like really, you know, of the level of Christ when he actually moves into the later volumes of the Bible, right? So it's a very, very cool story. It's one of my favorites. And but this all kind of started originally with this group of people known as the Hebrews, right? Or the children of Israel, right? So now their big shockwave, this monotheistic faith, is based all off 3 key factors. They believe in a God that is omniscient, which is all-knowing, omnipresent, which means exists everywhere, and omnipotent, which means all-powerful, right? Now, I have hand signals that I think actually helps a lot of the times, and I'm sure you already know this from Mr. Mathern's class, but omniscient to me is like this, right? Because they know everything. And then omnipresent means like this, because they exist everywhere. And then omnipotent is like this, because God is all powerful, right? So the Hebrews believe also that all events in history and their faith to be kind of interconnected, right? So each event is supposed to reflect God's plan for his chosen people, of course, that at the time that they believe being the people of the Jewish faith, right? So the Hebrew people themselves. So continuing forward, though, this is also just a fun little omnipresent, Matt. Get it? Omnipresent. Everywhere. It's good stuff. All right, now, anyway, so due to the, their views, though, right? Their views are going to begin to eventually be recorded in their holy book, the Hebrew Bible known as the Tanakh, right? So the Tanakh is actually the legitimate full series of the religious tomes of the Hebrew Bible, okay? And it includes all of their writings. A lot of people typically believe that the Torah is their holy book. That's actually not necessarily true. The Torah is the book that they use more on a day-to-day basis, right? Which outlines a lot of different stuff in their entire culture. And it's just one part of the book of the Talmud, right? It's actually 30% of it. And so it outlines their food structures, it outlines their daily ritual procedures, it outlines a lot more day-to-day stuff. It's used in bar and bat mitzvahs, right? Children becoming members of society, which is a super important thing as well. And this right here is an image of the Torah. And the Torah is actually usually held as a scroll, and a lot of times in these bar and bat mitzvah ceremonies, it's actually sang when it's ever being read in public. And it's also usually done in full Hebrew. So the Torah is just 1/3 of that, right? And the Tanakh contains 24 total books, right? It's 3 separate parts or testaments, and the Torah being one of them. Now, the Torah, though, of course, is super connected to the Christian faith, to our Christian faith as well, because it actually includes the first 5 books of the Old Testament Bible, the Holy Christian Bible, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, right? So huge, very, very important tome. And like I said, it is the one that is actually used most often on a day-to-day basis. But there's 2 separate books, right? There's the Tanakh, right? Which Mr. Mathern gave me a copy of, actually, which is really cool. If you want to take a look at it at any time, you're more than welcome. And then, of course, there's the Torah, right, itself. Now, continuing forward, though, the oldest version of this book, which relates to the founding of this ancient culture, right? You have to understand that the Hebrew people were founded so long ago, over 1,000 years before Christ was born. You have to understand they are going to have older versions of this book, right? Written in its original Hebrew text. Some of them actually later written in Aramaic. But the oldest version out of all of them is actually known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? It's actually outside of, it's in the modern-day Israel area, outside of the Dead Sea. And it was discovered recently, actually, in 1947, which some of you are like, that's forever ago. But it's less than 50 years ago, and it's over 2,000 years old. Sorry, got excited. It's over 2,000 years old, right? We've carbon dated it to be it's around the era of close to when Christ was being born. Now, it's written on papyrus, which is super interesting, actually, because it does give, the fact that it's written on papyrus does give more credit to the Exodus story due to the fact that the Egyptians were the very first people to invent papyrus, which means that there's a good to solid chance that the Hebrews and the Egyptians did interact on some level, right? So, and it was bound completely in leather, and it was encased in these giant clay pots, right? And they were found in a cave outside of the city of Qumran, right? Now, the cool thing about the cave itself is kind of how they were found. There's multiple stories about how they were found, but apparently the Dead Sea Scrolls were actually found on complete accident, right? They were found completely on accident, in complete happenstance. The story that I've heard that I like the most is that a boy was herding goats, right? Very young, about y'all's age, right? 1947, he's herding goats, and he's kind of keeping them around, and he's moving them around these different mountain areas and stuff, and he's picking, and like children do, he's picking up rocks, and he's throwing them into the caves and stuff like that. And apparently he threw one into a cave, and he heard a big and a big crash, right? And he was like, what was that? And he walks into the cave, and he discovers the Dead Sea Scrolls on complete accident, because he accidentally hit one of the pots that was holding them with a rock, right? So very, very cool thing. And going back to it really, really fast, the Dead Sea Scrolls also, in one of the pots, apparently also had a treasure map inside of it, right? And they had all the locations of all these gold and silver stores inside of it, but we think actually that there's a chance that those things were raided by because apparently archaeologists have gone to all these different sites that are on this treasure map but none of the stuff was there. It was already taken. More than likely, most likely, the people who took it were the Romans, right? So the Romans had occupied the entire Judaic state around 2,000 years ago, because as we know, Israel was under the control of the ancient Roman the Roman Empire when Christ was alive. And so due to this, we believe that the Romans, who had a particular trait of kind of taking and pillaging and burning and taking the best goods from places they took over, which stinks and it just happens. We believe, though, that all the stuff that was on that treasure map was actually taken by the Romans. But it's really cool that there was a treasure map inside of it, right? So now, going back to it, though, we believe that the father of the Judaic faith is this man known as, what? Abraham. Very, very good. Which, if you didn't know, is actually from a city that we've talked about. Remember when we talked about the tombs of actually containing a lot of really, really intense Sumerian artifacts? We believe that Abraham himself is actually from the city of right? So you are, right? From the Sumerian city of But him and his family eventually would move to the land known as Canaan, right? Present-day Palestine, all right? So after passing God's test, which I'm sure that y'all talked about in Mr. Bethurn's class, right? The God's test of being told to sacrifice his son, Isaac, right? And God, of course, is going to create a covenant or a binding agreement with Abraham during this test because he was willing to give up the thing he loved most for his God. Takes him up to the top of a mountain, is about to sacrifice his son, and then God stops him and then shows him the image of a ram, right? Another interesting image of the ram actually is also really cool. Speaking of cultural diffusion and the ties to the Egyptians, which actually, of course, again, gives some cultural diffusion properties to them knowing or understanding or being under the control of the Egyptians at one point, has to do with the fact that Ra oftentimes was symbolized as a ram in a lot of Egyptian art as well. So a little bit of religious parallelity as well again. Now, going further with it though, what is this covenant, right? What is the covenant that apparently God created with the Jewish people? Well, the covenant itself was apparently a promise or a binding agreement between the Jews and God as well. And that covenant was actually based on two particular things. The covenant between God and the Hebrews is supposed to be a special relationship between God and the Israelites, right? Also, of course, God known as Yahweh, right? Y-A-H-W-E-H. Special relationship between God and the Israelites now consider themselves as these chosen people, right? And also another part of the covenant, is the promised land of Canaan, right? So continuing forward, though, because I want to just kind of keep going and through. Some key differences in Judaism versus Christianity, though, just a couple things. There is no hell in Judaism. They actually believe in this kind of soul-cleansing practice that exists on the separate plane, which is really, really intense and very cool. So that's just an interesting component. Also, another interesting component is they do not seek to convert people. All right, so the Judaic faith does not attempt to convert or spread their religion. They believe that their religion is available, though, to everyone who wants to imbibe with it. They also believe that their God was compassionate, not necessarily a threat. A lot of times people kind of misinterpret the Old Testament stories as kind of a vengeful, wrathful God, which is not necessarily the true in all cases. They actually believe that their God was passionate, not necessarily threatening. And then also continuing forward, they base their entire Jewish law off of the original Ten Commandments, right? Eventually, which is going to evolve into Jewish law. And I'm really interested to see, and we're going to do this in class for extra credit, see if y'all can name all of the Ten Commandments without looking at any source whatsoever. But they do believe, as a part of their Ten Commandments, that the Jews believe in that their high morals would lead to salvation, whereas other Eastern religions did not necessarily have a code of conduct, which is super interesting. The only code of conduct or moral ideology that we've seen so far is Mott and Hammurabi's code, right? And as we know, Hammurabi's code was super intense and retributive law. And then Mott was kind of this idea of universal balance in ancient Egypt, whereas the Jewish faith is going to base Jewish law off these Ten Commandments, which is going to kind of include this code of conduct and moral ideas along with it, right? Which is kind of then becomes the basis of later Christian law. This right here is where we're going to stop with this flip. And we have a couple little small things left to talk about when we're talking about the growth of the ancient Hebrews. We're going to talk about kind of their society, how there's this brother law, which is pretty interesting to talk about during their ancient times. And there's also one other thing we're going to talk about when it comes to how they functioned in an economy, right? And how the Jewish community believes in the passing down of skills from father to son, right? So we'll talk about that stuff later on, though. See if you can name all those 10 Commandments whenever we get back into class. And I'll talk to you guys later. Y'all have a good one.